your book really does center around people's firsthand stories here in the US, in terms of displacement from climate change. Hundreds of thousands of people in the United States displaced from their homes every year due to the effects of climate change. Like, how did you come upon that structure? Did you go into writing your book with that intention, both making it more of like a personal focus on people's experience and also making it US based?
Yeah, so I thought that it would be useful to what I wanted to do at the start was just to try to document what the present tense, effects of climate change in the US were, because I thought that, people tend to conceive of it as a problem that will either happen, in the future, the distant future, or, somewhere else, like sort of very, very far distance across the globe. And especially with the, phenomenon of housing displacement or migration, I think people tend to think of it as something that is just not really like a US problem. And so what I was just trying to do is show, okay, after these climate disasters that, sort of appear and disappear from the news cycle relatively quickly, like what are the long-term effects on the communities where these disasters happen, and what ends up happening to people who get, temporarily displaced from their homes, how many of them make it back, and how many sort of end up moving somewhere else, whether voluntarily or involuntarily.
I really also liked how your title is a reference to the Great Migration, the 20th century migration of Black Americans to from the South, to other cities around the country. And it, what that part obviously must have been intentional as well, right? Because your book does do a great job of focusing on the racial politics of climate displacement in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of trying to draw both, there's both a similarity and a distinction, right? And one is that, the similarity is that, like the Great Migration, climate migration in the United States, it cleaves people along lines of race and class very distinctly. But there's also a dissimilarity, right? Where the Great Migration was a relatively sort of one directional movement of people from a very specific region of the country to a very specific other region. There was both a push factor and also a pull factor of, wages, the promise of better treatment in northern cities. And in the case of climate displacement, it's much more chaotic, right? Like, sort of happens everywhere in different parts of every region, and there's by no means like a single destination or coordinated direction of this movement. And so in the book, I kind of liken it to like when a pot is kind of like churning as it reaches a boiling point. It's more like people just, there's a kind of chronic, generalized instability in certain places that over time leads people to fly off in all different directions. So there's both a really distinct similarity, and that's like the racial and class divisions. And then there's a dissimilarity, which is like, it's just not by any means so coordinated or recognizably directional as the Great Migration was.
Have you considered what Ben Shapiro posed years ago, that people who are experiencing flooding should just sell their homes and then that kind of solves everything?
It's a very funny video that I watched several times while writing the book, and it's very interesting because like there's an element of that that's actually currently baked into the actual functioning of the housing market in coastal places, right? Which is like when people do buy a home in a risky area, they sort of have the assumption that they're going to be able to sell it to someone else, not Aquaman, as the video says, but
Yeah.
somebody else will go. And in part, it's because there's just not enough information in the market about what the potential risks are, and we don't exactly know what the timeline is. So sea level rise, it's very difficult to predict. So when I start a 30-year mortgage in, Miami, I don't really know how many 30-year mortgages there are left before the home is underwater. So yeah, I mean, there's a kind of like, I think I wanted to liken in the book to like when Wile E. Coyote like runs off the cliff and he doesn't notice that he's running on air until he looks down, but then as soon
Mm-hmm.
as he looks down, he starts falling. So like that Ben Shapiro's mistake is actually kind of like really, really insightful in a reverse way, because it's actually the way that the market works right now. And at some point that will change.
Yeah, I mean, you particularly focus on it, I would say, or maybe the uh, one of the more relevant parts to this particular talking point is your Santa Rosa example, where there was this massive housing shortage after wildfires. It's different than flooding, but it is an example of housing being at the forefront of this. And like my aunt lives in Santa Rosa. I have heard a lot about what that experience has been like. Um, it, through my family, like what facing those wildfires and how that created such insecurity there. Of course, for people on the front lines, it's devastating. Talk a bit about that chapter in your book,
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
wildfires affected the housing market there.
Right. Yeah, I think this is like it's a really, really important example because there was a really, really dire existing problem in that area before the wildfire, which is that there's just this extreme shortage of housing. It had one of the lowest vacancy rates in the country, and we can go into all the reasons why that's true in Northern California and California generally. But that wasn't caused by climate change, obviously. But then you have a city where there's already really no vacant rental housing. And then suddenly 4,000 or 5,000 homes get wiped off the map. And those are, not only apartments, but also relatively large homes that were owned by relatively wealthy people. And so it took this existing problem and made it like, it sort of supercharged it, right? Where you have these wealthy people who lost their homes and they're looking for a place to go. So maybe they have a second home and they suddenly say, okay, well, we're going to, kick our renter out of our second home and live there, or we're going to go to our vacation home. And there's this downward pressure that happened where renters and people who had the least equity in their homes already, they ended up basically getting pushed out of the market because there was no longer space for people at the top. And so everyone got crowded down. And so I spoke to several people who, they rented one apartment for every 6 months for years, and they paid, 3 times what they'd paid before the fire. I spoke to people who just gave up on California. They ended up moving to places like Kentucky where they had family. So yeah, it's just like created this sort of insane chaos for years. And the prices have never really stabilized because it takes so long to rebuild that supply. And in the meantime, more people show up, sort of undeterred by the fire. And so it's just like it's a mess, right? And that's the sense I was trying to capture in that chapter of just like those first few months and that first year after the fire, people were paying, 10 grand a month just to get a place to live. And there was just this like chaos and trauma of living through that market, almost more traumatic than the experience of fleeing the fire itself for many people.
The shock of having to essentially run through your savings
Yes,
just in a second to get
exactly.
housing after a climate disaster.
Right,
Um,
exactly.
I mean, these states like California, New York, that have kind of blue legislatures need to get to the forefront of creating some sort of fund for people to not even relocate them, but get some subsidy for finding housing during that period because like you speak about as well in the book the rising insurance premiums in a lot of these areas of the country. I mean, this is just going to become a huge problem as more climate displacement happens. Insurance not being able, people being priced out of insuring their homes in this way. Can you talk about that dynamic?
Yeah, this has also been an issue in California and Florida, especially, where basically the insurance companies they have difficulty. They're answerable to shareholders, so they have to turn a profit, and they kind of can't
Right.
turn a profit, or they say they can't, at least in California and Florida, because the amount they have to pay out in damages and claims and what's called reinsurance is more than they take in from the premiums, right? So basically, they say, well, if we can't raise prices to really, really high levels, we're just going to kind of have to get out of certain areas, these like mountainous areas of California, for instance, where it's just like too risky, they say, to insure. And so the state, like California legislature and the insurance office there, they've tried really hard to tamp down this sort of like runaway problem in the insurance market. But it's really, really difficult to find out a way to bring the companies to heel without driving them out of the state altogether, right? Because they could also say, we just don't want we don't want to write here, period, right? Let alone
Hmm.
just like in those specific areas. But I think like in general, in all the places where this happens with different perils, fire, hurricanes, windstorm damage, what you kind of see is that there's the kind of it really, really raises the threshold for who can afford home ownership, as opposed to renting, right? So
Yes, which is
there's this like
already insanely high
right,
given
right.
the quality of life for the generation that isn't the
Yeah,
baby boomers.
exactly. Like I think people who are my age will say, well, I couldn't afford a house anyway before climate
Yeah.
change. But like there's this serious thing where like we think in the United States of like the middle class, upwardly mobile homeowner as, you know, somebody who saves up and they put equity in a home. It's an investment, and they're supposed to be able to keep up with it and then use that to like ascend the income ladder. And that, because of, you know, housing supply shortages, and then because of insurance especially, it's kind of become like an illusion for a lot of people in the riskiest areas, right? Where the cost of insurance is just so much that it's impossible to keep up with most mortgages, even in, you know, relatively affordable areas. That's like a serious like spiritual problem for the country, as well as a policy problem, where it's like this sort of much touted class of people, the middle class, it's sort of being eroded by the cost of climate change.
Yeah. Juniper J, one of our IMers, writes in and said, also consider that in Florida, homeowners cannot get home insurance. DeSantis called for a special session to address this, but passed fascist legislation instead. I wasn't aware of that homeowner insurance element. Is that something
Yeah.
you're up on?
Yeah, so years ago, like about 3 decades ago, after a hurricane in 1992, the insurance market basically in Florida basically collapsed, and it was like, I mean, this is like a controversial way to put it. It was basically partially socialized. Like there's a public option for insurance, for windstorm insurance in Florida, and there's all these small private companies that still offer, but they have sort of started to flee in recent years as the cost of hurricanes has gone up. And like Juniper's right, there's a lot of people who can't get insurance except for through this public option, which is really expensive. It's not very good coverage, and everybody's going to it. So it's like this enormous burden on like the public purse. And I think the big question for the like very, very, very conservative Florida legislature is how do you manage this system where basically the taxpayers are now footing the bill for, you know, there's basically a public subsidy for insurance in risky places. And can they like turn it back into a normal market, you know, a functioning sort of the free market that a conservative want? I kind of think the answer is no. But in either case, right, like it's like you're basically transferring the risk of people who live in really, really risky areas, not often through fault of their own, but you're transferring that to everybody, even people who don't own homes, right? So
Mm.
basically, like you're taking a person who maybe owns a car in Orlando but rents an apartment, and their tax burden is in part the burden of like a person who owns a mansion in Miami Beach. So that's like a very, very difficult situation that I don't know that the legislature is quite equipped to address. They don't seem super interested in like a comprehensive solution.